In November 2022, Netflix, in its infinite wisdom, decided to honor Graham Hancock with a show called Ancient Apocalypse. Over the course of 8 episodes, Hancock, who serves as the main host, lays out a modified version of his case for an advanced civilization which existed during the last ice age. Here I would like to discuss and analyze Hancock's claims and compare them both to Hancock's previous work and to the current state of our knowledge of prehistory. To a large extent, the case that he makes on the show is much the same as the one he has made during his numerous appearances on the Joe Rogan Experience and in his 2019 book, America Before. However, there are some noteworthy differences. Hancock has had a considerable following since about the middle of the 1990s when he wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, a kind of first draft of his current thesis. Over time, he began to add more and more spiritual elements to his analysis, postulating that the shared tropes and similar architectural styles of early civilization must have stemmed from a common lost civilization. His spiritual claims centered on the idea that there were world-traveling wise men who visited all parts of the world and spread knowledge. Hancock's spiritual evidence included experiences that he had had while using ayahuasca and receiving visions from a goddess. Needless to say, this is somewhat at odds with his claim to be re-examining and reinterpreting archaeological data. Perhaps knowing that a mainstream audience would mock such claims in ways that the Joe Rogan audience should have but did not, Hancock wisely excluded those claims from his series. In fact, one of the things that he tries and fails to pin down is exactly how he and his so-called work fit into the larger discussion of prehistory. He does a great deal to try to distance himself from the discipline of archaeology, continuously dismissing archaeologists and their understanding of prehistory. The most generous way to interpret Hancock's objection to archaeology as a discipline is that he simply bemoans the rather conservative nature of the field and the hesitancy of its practitioners to make bold claims. In all academic disciplines, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. It is also in part, of course, a function of his bitterness over being dismissed as a pseudo-archaeologist for the last 2+ decades. Hancock recounts the various slights he has received with a good deal of animus in the series. He has clearly taken a relative smattering of mockery from a small number of archaeologists who know who he is over a few decades, and used it as an excuse to hate all archaeologists. He paints them with a broad brush and speaks of them with contempt. I'm reminded of the way that activists refer to obviously corrupt industries or institutions, such as Big Oil or Big Pharma. Therefore, I propose that in Hancock's mind, professional archaeologists are the foot soldiers of Big Dirt. Graham, if you're listening, you may borrow the term, but I do request that you provide some kind of acknowledgement or compensation for my contribution to your rhetorical arsenal. You're welcome. What is problematic about this is that all of Hancock's raw data, all of the information that he reinterprets to fit with his own construct of prehistory, comes from archaeologists, of course. All of the field work is, of course, performed by professional practitioners and of necessity shaped by the biases of modern archaeology. Further, even in the series, Hancock is typically successful at getting archaeologists to speak with him, even though most of them clearly think he's full of shit. They are more civil and professional when dealing with him than his attempt to generate a persecution narrative allows. Hancock is happy to take the testimony of one archaeologist or the consensus dating of a site if he believes that this bolsters his case, but he always casts doubt upon anything which suggests that civilization as we know it only became possible during the Holocene. Ironically, he accuses archaeologists of being dogmatic and failing to be open to new evidence and ideas. Hancock's examples of archaeology being impervious to change demonstrate that it is, in fact, open to change, and its paradigms have changed in light of new evidence. One example he draws upon is that the Clovis First theory was taught as fact for a long time, which of course implies, rather obviously, that it was in fact displaced in the light of additional finding and further study. To avoid associating himself with archaeology, Hancock has taken to simply labeling himself as an investigative journalist. To be fair, this was his profession before he began to focus on prehistory in the mid-1990s. Journalists can sometimes create fine popular works by simplifying and synthesizing scholarship for a general audience. However, that is neither what Hancock has done in the past nor what he is trying to do in the present. Hancock's cherry-picking means that he is not accurately representing the views of archaeologists, and he is filling in any gaps that he finds with pure conjecture. In essence, his proposed alternative to current archaeology, which requires evidence and investigation and only draws conclusions warranted by said evidence, is to take an interesting hypothesis and force evidence that does not fit to somehow fit. This approach will become more evident as we examine the content and claims of each of the 8 episodes. What we will find is that not only does Hancock consistently fail to produce the kind of evidence required to back his claims, but he even provides us with just enough evidence and context to make it laughably obvious that he is stretching the evidence beyond the breaking point. His most frequent tactic is to simply claim on faith that the things that he examines are vastly older than the evidence suggests. One thing noticeably absent from both Hancock's series and many of the rebuttals to it, that I have seen at least, is that there is no attempt to clearly define the parameters of a civilization. Does a civilization, for instance, require the existence of a system of writing? Any semi-serious examination of the birth of civilization, or that claims to investigate, quote, advanced civilization, should naturally start with some effort to establish what differentiates a civilization from sizable settlements which lack a fully developed culture. Of course, given Hancock's tendency to have a disinterest in such things as chronology and facts, I suppose that it is nitpicking to expect a series claiming to be a documentary to ask fundamental questions. After all, it has only a mere 4 hours of total runtime. Now, let's go ahead and dive into the episodes and see what Hancock has to say. Episode 1. Once There Was a Flood, Gunung Padang in Indonesia. The claim by Hancock and his chosen expert, who is some kind of kook who believes that Atlantis was in Indonesia, is that Gunung Padang as an archaeological site could date to the Younger Dryas, or even to about 20,000 years ago, which would make it several thousand years prior to the Younger Dryas. Ali Akbar, the other expert, dates the site based on the cultural remains there, and that makes it too new to date to the Younger Dryas. One interesting omission in the coverage of Gunung Padang is that it is an ancient volcano. Most extinct volcanoes have chambers inside of them. One of Hancock's favorite claims is that the presence of interior chambers in monumental architecture proves a similar origin. However, if Gunung Padang does turn out to have interior chambers, then we have to account for the fact that those chambers were very likely formed by natural processes and not by deliberate architectural design. Not only do we fail to get a sufficiently ancient date for Gunung Padang in order for it to be a part of Hancock's proposed globe-trotting civilization, but we also get no indication that the site has any connections to other parts of the world. Even if someone could prove the antiquity of the site, they would still have to establish that there was a broader link with the outside world, that the people who built Gunung Padang were present elsewhere. The first episode was a weak start to the series, as the example of Gunung Padang does not help Hancock's case in any way. His central claim is that an ancient civilization centered on the continental shelves existed during the last ice age, and that this site is on, while the site is on high ground, the site is on a mountain. So this would not really do much to prove his idea. Further, the known dates of the site do not support Hancock's thesis in any way. It is very common for well-known temple sites to have been places of worship far before the construction of a more iconic structure there, the Acropolis in Athens being a prime example. For Gunung Padang's existence to aid Hancock in any way, he would need to find at least a shred of evidence for occupation from the Younger Dryas, and he does not. The only value of the episode was to introduce an archaeological wonder little known to most of the Western world to a broader audience. Of the 8 episode topics, this one is perhaps the worst suited of the lot to use as a starting point for Hancock's central thesis. Episode 2, Stranger in a Time of Chaos, Cholula in Mexico. Once again, Hancock focuses on a pyramid having inner chambers and an alignment with the stars. Once again, the only real achievement of the episode is to highlight a few really cool sites that are often neglected. Hancock's assumption that all pyramids serve the same function is baseless. For instance, Mesopotamian ziggurats, which are fairly similar in design and concept, were primarily utilized as temples and centers of ceremony and government, whereas Egyptian pyramids were clearly intended to be tombs for Egyptian rulers. The archaeologist that Hancock interviews does not comment on Hancock's theory, tepidly admitting the obvious, namely that we do not know everything about the site, a statement which could be made about any archaeological site in the world, even those which were erected during the era of recorded history. For his next stop, Texcoco, which looks like a modified natural hill more so than the pyramid, Hancock finds another Atlantis nutter to claim without evidence that the site dates back to deep antiquity. The problem is that this site was constructed in the 15th century CE by the Aztecs, and no one else in the world disputes that. Speaking of the nutter in question, Marco Vagato, he is the source of the controversy online that you may have seen, where some archaeologists are accusing Hancock of promoting white supremacy because of his affiliation with this man. Vagato's recent book, The Empires of Atlantis, has a convoluted theory about how modern humans evolved on Atlantis that involves controlled evolution, Aryans, and some other stuff. Personally, I view Vagato's claims as less racist and more simply a bizarre remix of unrelated and strange ideas. But even by Hancock's standards, this man is a substandard associate. Hancock, Carlson, and von Daniken are all at least capable of making claims that are comprehensible, even if they are not founded in a whole hell of a lot of evidence. With Vagato, even basic logic gets thrown out of the window. There is little meaningful difference between interviewing Vagato and a random meth addict at a Greyhound station who has read a few fantasy novels and managed to blend all the content of the novels in with his own life. Episode 3, Sirius Rising, Malta. In the third episode, Hancock explores some interesting sites on Malta, but makes literally no points. This is easily the weakest episode in the entire series, or at least it's in contention. Gigantea, a site on Malta, is about 5,500 years old, which makes it one of the oldest Neolithic sites in the world, and that is where we begin. Here, Hancock, the champion of ancient advancement, doubts that simple Neolithic farmers could create megaliths. Hancock's other argument is that there are too many temples in too small of a space, and so they could not have been built simultaneously. Given that archaeologists think that these temples were built over a 1,400-year period, I don't see what point Hancock thinks he's proving. There's no one who thinks these were built simultaneously, and there's no reason why they would have needed to have been built simultaneously. The only interesting thing in the episode is that one of the people Hancock interviews managed to prove that one of the ancient teeth found there in the 1910s was in fact a Neanderthal tooth. Unfortunately, proving the existence of humans and Neanderthals in the distant past is not breaking new ground, and does not prove that the people who contributed these teeth built any extensive structures. As for the cart ruts, these are a mystery. No one knows when or how the ruts got into the rocks. It is an archaeological wonder, but aside from arguing that it could be linked to his proposed civilization, Hancock does nothing to clarify the mystery. The episode's name is derived from another guest's claims that the temples are older than the carbon dating suggests by several thousand years, and that the temples were aligned to point to the star Sirius. However, a simpler explanation is that the angle of the temples helps them fill with sunlight in the morning. One of those two things. You decide which one makes more sense. Episode 4, Ghost of a Drowned World, Bimini Road and the Bahamas. Hancock begins this episode by promising to show us Atlantis, takes us to the Bimini Road and to see some other stuff, and then shakes his head sadly toward the end of the episode and says, "This isn't Atlantis." Thanks, Graham, you troll. The beach rock of the Bimini Road is almost certainly naturally occurring. It also is composed of beach rock which was formed most likely between 2700 and 3500 years ago, when it was already underwater and long after the end of the Younger Dryas. The worst use of evidence in the entire series also occurs in this episode, when Hancock pulls out an old map and says that the information in the map dates back to 10,000 or more years ago, and then shows us the road. In fact, this is a map from around 500 years ago. However, the map maker in question clearly indicated that he was trying to draw Hispaniola. Hancock's odd claims about maps from the early age of discovery, namely that they were actually based on traditions dating back to before the last ice age rather than to what were at the time new discoveries, was a feature of many of his early works, such as Fingerprints of the Gods. Hancock has been taken to task for this ridiculous use of old maps by Emperor Tigerstar and many others on YouTube, in addition to all of the numerous book reviews he has received over the years. In fact, there is a Latin legend on the map referring to the southern landmasses on the map, stating that they are newly discovered and not fully explored. It is almost as if Hancock is simply too proud to admit that he has made an obvious and embarrassing mistake. And here we are, nearly 30 years later, and he continues to press forward with it. There's a good deal of irony in Hancock's literal belief in Atlantis. One of the central themes of any Hancock podcast appearance is about how everyone should strive to achieve a greater level of humility. The core of Plato's Tale of Atlantis in the dialogue Timaeus is that both Atlantis and ancient Athens were humbled by the gods for their excessive hubris, and that resulted in ecological disaster. For the self-proclaimed prophet of humility to fail to recognize his favorite theme in one of the greatest works of literature to explore that idea is the height of irony. Episode 5, Legacy of the Sages, Göbekli Tepe. Hancock begins by saying that Sumer is soon to be displaced as the birthplace of civilization. That's actually not all that controversial. Sumer has only really held that place in our understanding of the development of civilization for about the past 100 years. It was only then that we had uncovered enough of Sumer and done dating to realize that it was in fact the oldest known civilization that we had discovered. The reason why it gets the nod for being the oldest civilization is again because the definition of civilization matters. Sumer gets the nod still because it had writing. So far, we have no evidence that Göbekli Tepe, which predates Sumer, had a system of writing. So again, we do need to define our terms at least a little bit. As a side note, it has always been curious to me that Hancock does not try to work the Sumerians into his story, since they also built on a grand scale and gave us many examples of myths that would later be transmitted to later generations. For instance, the first known versions of the flood story come from Sumer. Given his interest in myth and his idea that many of these stories were shared around the world by a proto-culture, his decision to really ignore Sumer is hard to explain. However, I think there is a pretty good reason why he doesn't want us to think about Sumer too long or hard, and that is, it shows that historians and archaeologists were open to new ideas. We completely changed our understanding of prehistory based upon the findings of Sumer. So now that we understand about Sumer, this has completely changed the way that early history is taught. So because of that, it does not fit with his narrative of archaeologists trying to ignore the evidence and just simply demonize him. Hancock says that Göbekli Tepe is being neglected, and that is definitely not true. Göbekli Tepe has been a known site for several decades, and its antiquity has been known and commonly taught as the oldest megalithic site in the world for at least 20 years. Hancock proudly tells us that it was built before the domestication of the horse, which is actually not an impressive claim, since horses were first domesticated a mere 6,000 years ago, which is around 500 years before the Sumerians began to write the first cuneiform. No one at the current time thinks that Göbekli Tepe was built after the Sumerians first invented cuneiform. The megalithic site at Göbekli Tepe is actually older than that, as the people who built it had not yet even discovered agriculture. All of the grains found there, at least the majority, were wild rather than domesticated. Hancock claims that this is the earliest attempt at a megalithic construction, but then contradicts himself by pointing out that there is another nearby site that might be earlier and may have been something of a test run. Since his thesis is that Göbekli Tepe had advanced construction techniques and it just produced them out of the blue, that's kind of a problem. His idea is that immigrants from some unknown place, a place that had been flooded out, arrived there from lower ground with those advanced techniques in hand and built a grand structure like it was nothing. Hancock himself demonstrates that his proposed lost civilization is not needed to explain Göbekli Tepe by pointing out that there is a test site nearby where they did this before on a smaller scale. Hancock's new friend that he meets at Göbekli Tepe says that the symbology here refers to the stars. But that's not exactly clear. One of the points that Hancock raises at the start of the episode is that the night sky would have been easily visible every clear night, and that many ancient people would be intimately familiar with where the stars are. That being said, given how clear the sky was and how easy it would have been to spot things, one can fairly ask Hancock why the ancients would orient their temples to point out certain stars when they would have no trouble finding them with their naked eye. Hancock, to the best of my knowledge, has never been asked that. He just assumes that everyone built temples oriented to face certain stars, and that must have some sort of deeper celestial meaning, and that it was some sort of message for the future. Episode 6, America's Lost Civilization, Serpent Mound and Poverty Point. We begin the 6th episode at Poverty Point in Louisiana, a massive site that is often neglected because it is in the rural north of the state. Hancock got into a debate with the manager of the site over the meaning of the post holes, although we don't really get the director's full responses due to editing. Hancock at one point demands to know why the ancients at Poverty Point were indifferent to the stars, and the director replies that they probably were interested in the stars, but we don't really know exactly what their interest was. And we don't really know what the North American natives were thinking either. He also observes that without the full monument being intact, we can't really say what features in the sky or the landscape the monument was oriented to highlight or to display. Hancock clearly believes that he won the debate, since it appears in his documentary, and he wears a smug grin while he's receiving this answer, but really all he did was put forward a hypothesis without evidence, and the director pointed out that while that could be true, Hancock needs to do a whole lot more work in order to prove anything of the sort. At Serpent Mound, Hancock proposes that the whole thing represents a streaking comet, and that it is thousands of years older than most scholars believe. The traditional date is around 1000 CE, which, if that date were off by, say, 66 years, that would correspond with 1066 CE, when Halley's Comet was spotted around the world. It is possible, therefore, that Hancock is right that the serpent is supposed to represent a comet. However, when he tries to tie in Serpent Mound with his Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, he runs into a bit of difficulty. Yes, it's around this point that he finally drops the bomb on us by introducing the idea that it was a comet impact on the North American ice sheet, which then set in motion the events of the Younger Dryas and the end of the last ice age. This is the kind of information that would have worked far more effectively had it come earlier in the show, as that would have established a context in which Hancock's civilization could first flourish and then decline and die. Instead, the show chooses to present the thesis in reverse of the logical order, and then doesn't even do that competently, since the next episode is basically an irrelevant side quest before the thread of the science side of Hancock's thesis is taken up one more time. Hancock claims that the mound was highlighting a star, which has shifted 2 degrees since the monument was erected. The problem is that the monument was renovated both by the Native Americans and then by the U.S. or Ohio government in more modern times. We therefore do not know precisely how the serpent's mouth was originally oriented when the monument was originally constructed, or indeed if it had all of the features it currently has when it was first built, or whether it was altered during its early restorations. Another major problem with trying to date Serpent Mound back as far as Hancock's claims is that the site would have been blisteringly cold and not that far removed from the edge of the great glaciers from the last ice age. The soil would have been not unlike modern Alaska, where there is permafrost, which makes it difficult to dig into the soil to build anything complicated. Having Alaskan or Siberian-style winters would also mean that the hard work of creating the serpent mound would require constant care nearly every summer. It would make far more sense if it were not constructed until later, when the area was much more habitable and the soil was more yielding. Perhaps the most entertaining part of the whole episode is Hancock's hissy fit when he was forbidden to film at Serpent Mound by the current curator, who has hosted him before and thought that dealing with him again was a waste of time. Predictably, he claimed censorship and the closed-mindedness of Big Dirt. Hancock still found an actual archaeologist to talk to him, however, and once again this person did not validate any of Hancock's claims. Episode 7, A Fatal Winter, Derinkuyu. As a site associated with early Christianity, the underground hive-like structure at Derinkuyu has been studied extensively. The scholarly consensus is that the earliest habitation of the site dates to around 800 BCE, as that is the date of the earliest objects found there. However, Hancock thinks that it must be significantly older, and that the impetus for constructing the underground shelter was to find refuge during the catastrophe that ended the last ice age and began the Younger Dryas. Not only is there no evidence which suggests that this is the case, but there is another glaringly obvious issue that Hancock ignores. If, as he suggests, the Younger Dryas featured the ice caps melting away rapidly and it was a time of massive destructive floods, even in areas that are relatively raised, like Cappadocia, which is 1,000 meters above sea level, one has to wonder, what possible safety could a person find by going underground during a time of major flooding? To circle back to Hancock's claim about the extreme antiquity of the underground complex, it is worth noting that Derinkuyu, a site with Christian associations, because of those associations, has been far more studied than sites that lack those associations. If there were objects older than 800 BCE, the odds are very good that someone would have found them by now, given how many times this place has been picked over. There is another piece of comedic irony in the episode, which when combined with how foolish Hancock sounded when he was complaining about his treatment at Serpent Mound, makes me suspect that he and his editor must not have been on very good terms. Hancock by this point has been taking shots at archaeologists for being dogmatic, arrogant, and closed-minded for over 3 hours by this point in the series. Now he puts forward his ideas to an archaeologist at Derinkuyu, who says that it's possible the site's much older, but that the current dating is merely the most plausible explanation based on the current state of the evidence. Hancock's rebuttal amounts to, "Come on, It's older, right? To which the archaeologist again replies in an even-handed manner. The archaeologist, in other words, was more receptive of Hancock than Hancock was of him. Perhaps so many years of combating big dirt has turned Hancock into the foe he so loathes. Another thing that occurs to me about Derinkuyu is that the excavation of soft rock would have been vastly easier at around the time of the traditional date of 800 BCE, since by then iron tools were available. While metal tools are not necessary for constructing complex structures, they can be very useful if you're trying to dig into the earth. And Derinkuyu would be a place where they would be especially handy. Episode 8, Cataclysm and Rebirth, Washington State. Calling upon his friend and frequent collaborator Randall Carlson, Hancock explores the channeled scablands of eastern Washington, which were formed by flooding and drainage. The two argue that the flooding was a few thousand years more recent than the consensus date of 18 to 14,000 years ago, and that rather than being the result of repeated flooding over a long period of time, all of the features that we see today were formed in about 10 days. It is mildly refreshing that Hancock is claiming that something is newer rather than older, as this shows that he's aware it's possible to overestimate the age of something. Hancock tries to frame this area as being at the heart of the Younger Dryas catastrophe, as the site was relatively near his proposed impact site where the comet debris slammed into the ice shelf, and this shows the force of the flooding from a rapid melting of the ice sheet. The reasons that the two propose are not terribly convincing. Conveniently, having the asteroid or comet strike on the ice sheet negates the need for an impact crater. Since Hancock's whole theory revolves around the Younger Dryas catastrophe and making it clear that the event was sufficiently destructive to account for the absence of evidence of his proposed civilization, he really should have put this episode nearer to the start of the show. Once again, Hancock succeeds in showing off an interesting part of the world, this time a natural feature rather than an archaeological site. The episode also succeeds in introducing fascinating geological debate about how the scablands formed. However, just like all of the preceding episodes, the 8th and final episode fails to present any convincing reason to believe that Hancock's hypothesis has merit. Conclusion. Hancock's primary argument in Ancient Apocalypse is that there was a worldwide civilization at the height of the last ice age. Conveniently, he does not bother to tell us what he means by civilization, so that he can employ any evidence to serve any purpose. Unlike in his most recent book, America Before, he heavily downplays the spiritual elements of his hypothesis in the documentary. The most common argument that he employs when presenting sites around the world is that he says, without evidence, that these sites must all be older than they appear, and they must all have stemmed from this one lost civilization in some way, whether directly or indirectly. He expands upon the antiquity of great monuments by trying to find the earliest possible evidence of human activity at the site, and then hoping that viewers aren't aware that sites, especially religious sites, tend to be developed over many generations, and that they become more fully elaborated and built up as time marches on. Of course, even the earliest dates that he can find that are legitimate dates are still far too late to help his case. Therefore, we must accept his word that archaeologists, for some bizarre, unknown reason, obscure the past on purpose, or perhaps they just suck at their jobs and there is some never-defined flaw in the discipline of archaeology. The only accomplishment of this documentary is to introduce a general audience to some of the most interesting archaeological sites from around the world, even if a great deal of time is wasted trying to demonstrate that each of these sites is proof of Hancock's far-fetched hypothesis. In conclusion, Hancock is as much of a two-bit con man as ever, and there is no reason to put any stock in anything that he has to say about human prehistory. P.S. I know from experience that some of you Hancock fanboys will complain that I was condescending to or dismissive of Mr. Graham Hancock. There's a good reason why I treat him the way that I do. I believe in treating people the way they deserve to be treated based on their behavior and honesty or lack thereof. Hancock is a lying piece of shit, and so I am merely treating him appropriately. Rather than taking umbrage at my tone, I suggest that you attempt critical thought instead. It hurts a little at first, but much like exercise, it becomes easier with practice. Thank you. Fuck you. Bye.